Amen. So Leviticus 17 is where we're going to stop in terms of our Leviticus study. Starting in chapter 18, we get into what is commonly known as the Holiness Code, and it gets into a lot of horizontal relationships within the community. Very important section, but also one that goes all the way through to the end of the book. So Lord willing, we'll tackle that one on our next session. So Leviticus 17 is what we're going to talk about tonight. Then next week, Lord willing, we'll talk about how Leviticus 17 is dealt with in the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. And then in 2 weeks, going back to Leviticus 10, verse 10. And the teaching of holiness, and to summarize where we've been and what all of that means to Christians, to the church. So in Leviticus 17, we have basically the source passage for something you're all familiar with. Kosher. Only kosher, as it's used today, even in Jewish circles, is far removed from what it was in Leviticus 17. One thing that any Orthodox rabbi will be very quick to point out is kosher is not a style of food. And so all of the packages that say kosher style pretzels and all of that, that's totally wrong. It's not like Mexican or Thai. It's not a type of food. It actually has to do, and it doesn't really even have to do with the preparation of the food. Ultimately, what it has to do with is the disposition of the animal. And that's where it originally comes from. Now, as with most Jewish practices, the rabbis got a hold of it, and they have added to it as they had Torah in general. But the idea of kosher then, first of all, is it's not a style of food, but it's a preparation. Kosher starts at the slaughterhouse, not at the grocery store or the restaurant. Those in the rabbinic community that certify, and kosher is something that is now, it's certified, they're going to go all the way to what you do with the chicken, what you do with the cow, what you do with the lamb. And so it has to do with two forms of preparation. One, and they are related. They are very much related because certain forms of slaughter will not yield kosher food. And so the way an animal is slaughtered, for example, a chicken, if its neck is wrung, or a cow that is stunned, that's not kosher. Because in order for it to be kosher, its slaughter requires the shedding of blood. So that's the second thing with kosher, is the disposition of the blood. And there's the connection with, both of them actually are the connection with Leviticus 17. Leviticus 17 has the famous verse, verse 11, where God says, "The life is in the blood, and I have given it for you on the altar for atonement for your souls." That's where we're headed. That's the apex of the chapter. But the whole chapter is about how an animal is, how do I say this? How an animal is killed in order to be food. And because of the prohibition against consuming blood, kosher requirements are that, however, obviously the animal must first be a clean animal. You can't have a kosher pig. Doesn't matter how you prepare it, it's unclean, and therefore it's not kosher. But a deer, for example, and we'll talk about that in Leviticus 17, Animals that you would raise in the herd or the flock, or animals you would kill on a hunt. As long as the animal is clean, there is a Levitical law in terms of how it is killed and what is immediately done regarding the disposition of the blood. And so it's all about blood in chapter 15 or 17, and it really is kind of the explanatory chapter for everything that's gone before. Because we've spent since chapter 1 listening to Moses or the Lord tell Moses or the Lord tell Aaron about blood, about what to do with the blood, about taking a bird and tying it up with hyssop and dipping it in the blood, or taking the blood and sprinkling it on the altar on the Day of Atonement, or taking the blood with your thumb and putting it on the sides of the altar, or taking the blood and putting it on the lobe of the right ear and the thumb of the right hand and the big toe of the right foot. It's always, I mean, there are waters in there, but the common element is blood. And so here in chapter 17, it's like the Lord is now saying, okay, now I'm going to just basically talk about blood and why you are not to consume it because of its significance. So this is the background for kosher. And when you read this, and then you if you were to look up kosher online and just get the various things that are done now, you realize it's changed quite a bit. A lot of things that are done now have nothing to do with what the Bible says, which is to be expected. Again, though, this is not about hygiene. As with the clean and unclean animals, what we're talking about here doesn't have anything to do with the unhealthy aspect of blood, which it's that cannot even be proven that blood is inherently unhealthy. I'm not suggesting that you have any, but the point is, actually, one Jewish rabbi makes the comment. Many modern Jews think that the laws of kashrut, which is kosher preparation, are simply primitive health regulations that have become obsolete with modern methods of food preparation. Well, it's kind of nice to know that modern Jews are as ignorant of their own traditions as modern Christians are. But they do also have this idea that it's this archaic rule that had to do with the fact, that they didn't know how long to cook pork, or blood was inherently unhealthy in that day. But he says, however, health is not the main reason for Jewish dietary laws, and in fact, many of the laws of kashrut have no known connection with health. Now, that's just a contemporary Jewish rabbi who wrote a number of articles on kosher and the whole concept there.
That's very similar, I think, to the Muslims use for halal.
Yes.
Very similar.
Right. They also, the Muslims also have food laws and preparation requirements. And they have, what is it called? Halal. Yes, okay. And so, yeah, it's parallel, yes. And we don't really have that, although in certain times and in certain areas of Christianity, denominations, this comes back. This idea of how you prepare your food. For example, we're going to talk about consuming the meat with the blood, or the blood with the meat. Well, there are, or at least there certainly were, people that think that means that you must cook the steak well done. That if it, if you have it rare or even medium rare, you're eating the blood with the meat. That's what people think. That's what we kind of grew. I didn't grow up with, but that was generally the view of your family. Although, having been around cows all day long, I think I'd probably want them well done too. But we have these ideas. The Jews do, the Muslims do, and it's interesting. Now, I think the Muslims are even closer to the Jewish view in that it does have to do with the blood. Blood is a very significant issue in this whole concept of sacrifice. But God is making it an issue of covenant life. And he's saying it's not just when you're coming to the tabernacle. And as we look at Leviticus 17, we'll see that it may not cover every eventuality in which a Jew would find himself with a dead animal, a slaughtered or hunted animal. But there aren't a whole lot of others that I could think of that aren't covered in Leviticus 17. And it does, as I said, it centers around the idea of blood. And it shouldn't surprise us to find that blood is a major element in all ancient cultures and religions and all ancient rituals in those religions. And blood is something that has a unique characteristic and power within human society, unlike any other liquid. And certainly unlike any other bodily fluid. Blood has a place that is not occupied by any others. A 19th century anthropologist who professed to be a believer, I don't have any reason to think that he wasn't, even though he was an anthropologist, but he studied the ancient Semitic people and their religious rituals, and he wrote this in his work. He said, "The notion that by eating the flesh, or particularly by drinking the blood of another living being, a man absorbs its nature or life into his own, is one which appears among primitive peoples in many forms." So the view in the ancient world was the absorption of life through the consumption of blood. Now, this would incorporate cannibalism. I don't know a whole lot about cannibalism. Hasn't been something I've studied deeply, but I'm fairly certain that it wasn't because you were hungry. That most tribes that are even today that are cannibals, it is a part of their ritual. They don't have to run from everybody just in fear of being eaten by your neighbor, and they do eat other meats and vegetables. That's not their only diet, but their ritual to their gods involves not only killing a human sacrifice, but eating it, consuming it. In ancient pagan cultures, the idea of eating your slain enemy's heart was to absorb the strength of that warrior into your own body, into your own strength. So this idea is quite prevalent in ancient literature. The idea that there is, as we read in Leviticus 17, I'm going to write this down, victorious absorption, I'm not sure which one, of the conquered. Obviously, the one who was conquered was not as powerful as the one who conquered. Nonetheless, if this was a mighty enemy, by drinking their blood or by eating the heart, the one who was victorious gains in power and becomes even more respected and stronger in the eyes of his own tribe and feared in the eyes of the conquered tribe. So again, there's this life. I'm going to take this life and I'm going to absorb it into my own. And that's the idea that we read in Leviticus 17. And that is essentially there's just a complete uniformity in perspective. And that is, blood is life. And the shedding of blood is euphemistic for murder. Not just the shedding of blood in a sacrificial way, but the shedding of blood, even in the Old Testament, is often a euphemism for murder. Like when God says to Noah, if by man a man's blood is shed, well, what does that mean? If a man kills another man, then by man his blood shall be shed. He will be executed. So there's that concept. Blood is life. Now again, I've mentioned this many times. Sometimes we as conservatives in our biblical doctrine and our view of the inerrancy of Scripture, we want to see the Bible to be so completely different from the pagan cultures around it that there's no similarity whatsoever. Because the liberals over the past 200 years have taken these similarities and now they're trying to tell us that the Bible is borrowed from these other cultures. I don't think you have to go to one extreme to the other. I think we can realize that this is a common human race and that Israel was chosen out from among the nations. And we're going to even read in chapter 17 that they're to stop doing something that they had been doing. So Joshua talks about Abraham or Abram and his fathers worshiping idols on the other side of the Euphrates. In other words, Abraham wasn't a Jew when God called him. That would have been completely anachronistic to begin with. But he wasn't a Yahweh worshiper when God called him. He was a pagan. And so it's out of that milieu of paganism that God draws. And it's very similar to us. And when we're born again, we don't all of a sudden become some ethereal elf, some saint with no emotion. No, we're still the person we were in the culture in which we were born and grew up. And it doesn't mean that culture is all, in orientation it is all wrong. But not everything that the world does is wrong. It's still filled with men and women created in the image of God. And so when we look at these similarities, what we should look at is not, Moses was borrowing from the Babylonians. No. What we should look at is the Bible gets it right. That when you look at the pagan literature, you see that it's demonic, it's satanic, it's pagan, it's polytheistic, it's degrading, it's inhuman. And then you look at the Scriptures and you realize, well, this is a corrective of all of that. This is okay. This is what you were doing, and what the pagans were doing was a corruption of the original truth. They understood the power that blood represents in life, but they completely corrupted it. And they did that which God is naturally going to forbid, and that is they sought to augment their life through something other than Himself. And that's really the root of where we're heading with this. So the idea then about the forbidding of blood, as I mentioned, it does go back all the way to Genesis. And I want to quickly read, I have it here. Genesis 9. And we've read this before with regard to the concept of the animals. So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, on all that move on the earth, and all of the fish of the sea." There's that Genesis 1 pattern again in terms of the animals of the air, the animals of the land, and the animals of the sea. "They are given into your hand. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all living things, or all things, even as the green herbs. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. Surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of man. From the hand of, every man's brother I will require the life of man." Basically, this gets into the Levitical laws in terms of, for example, if a bull gores and kills a neighbor, there's something you need to do about that, because God will require at the hand. It's kind of obviously it's metaphoric. It's at the hand of every beast and at the hand of every man, and then immediately he goes into, "If any man shed another man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for man was created in the image of God." So that follows this passage. And here, all the way back, and this is the start of, in a sense, not a new humanity, but it's kind of a restart for the Adamic humanity. And it starts with the common, be fruitful and multiply, but it changes in that God is now giving man meat. Prior to this, all evidence shows that mankind was vegetarian, and that animals were also. Now we have a completely different paradigm on earth, and yet we have this Leviticus 17 command all the way back in Genesis 9, you will not eat the meat with its blood. But that's, again, what leads to kosher. And as we read in Leviticus 17, the idea is you must drain the blood out of the animal for it to be acceptable then as meat. Okay? It does not have to do, I don't believe, but it does not have to do with how far you cook your meat. It has to do with the disposition. You cannot leave the animal with its blood in it, which, as I said earlier, means you cannot strangle, you cannot electrocute or stun, you cannot, whatever means that, that we use today to slaughter animals, if it doesn't shed the blood. And I'm not saying that we have to follow this anymore. Let me interject that. If it doesn't shed the blood, then at the very basis, it's not kosher. Okay? And it would not meet with the Jewish Leviticus 17 laws. And so that puts all of our attention in Leviticus 17 really on the blood. And if we look at Leviticus 17, we see that it does have an interesting and really unique structure, unlike any other passage, at least in Leviticus. I'm not sure there are any others that I can think of, but its structure is that of an inverted V. So we're going to look now at the actual chapter. So it looks like this. And at the top, the apex, we have verses 10 through 12. The chapter hinges on these three verses in the middle. There's the introductory, verses 1 and 2, but then verses 3 through 7, they deal, and we'll talk about these in detail in a moment. Then verses 8 and 9. Then as we come back down the V, verses 13 and 14. And I'm going to put the next one in a different color, because this one gave me fits, verses 15 and 16. And I'm going to present, that's not much different, but verses 15 and 16 are difficult for a couple of reasons. The first reason is syntactical. The way each of these little sections is written tells us that they are an individual section in the overall chapter, because they each start. So if we say this is 1, 2, 3, and 4, and this is 5. So those are the little subsections of the chapter. Okay. 1, 2, 3, and 4 all start and end the same way. They all start with the Hebrew word translated, if any man. Okay. Now, it may be translated different ways. If any Israelite, but it is literally, if any man. So if any man, and then it goes on as to what the man does, he will be cut off. And so it starts with that, and it ends with some form of being cut off. Okay. Verses 15 and 16 don't have that formula. So that's the first anomaly for verses 15 and 16. Okay. The second is that verses 15 and 16 seem to permit something that Deuteronomy 14 forbids. And also, it permits something that seems to go against the basic gist of Leviticus 17. And I want to deal with that first, because I don't see it as a major issue. It's just one that I haven't solved. I haven't solved it. But let's look at verses 15 and 16 and kind of get them out of the way. I hope this won't be controversial, because it's not really, well, in my opinion, it's not a major issue. But I do want to show that it's a little bit problematic. Verses 15 and 16 say this. And when any person eats an animal which dies, so it does have kind of the if any man start, but doesn't have the same ending. If any person eats an animal which dies or is torn by beasts, whether he is a native or an alien, he shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and remain unclean until evening, and then he will become clean. But if he does not wash them or bathe his body, then he shall bear his guilt. See, it doesn't have the cut off. It ends with a different ending. So it doesn't have quite that same formula as the other four. The main problem is that Deuteronomy forbids any Israelite from eating an animal that either died of its own or was torn by other animals. Now, it was permissible to give that to strangers. You could give that to someone else, to a non-Jew. But a Jew was not allowed to do that. So you have a problem here, okay? Whereas Leviticus 17 seems to allow it, Deuteronomy 14, I'm pretty sure it's 14, I have it in the notes, forbids it. I wasn't able to solve what seems to be a discrepancy there, and I haven't found anybody who gives the typical modern approach, which is in the Old Testament usually liberal, is that God changed his mind, that a particular law turned out to be impractical, and therefore he relieved that one and gave another one, Abe and then Aaron.
Well, he says here at the very end, in the ESV says, I don't know if you read that, he shall bear his iniquity.
His iniquity, okay. There's several iniquities we're going to look at here. And that may be the solution, that the iniquity may be that he's doing something that he shouldn't be doing. Aaron.
It's notable, though, that Deuteronomy
12, yeah.
You may have been thinking of Deuteronomy 14, I'm not sure, but I was thinking of Deuteronomy 12, where they are permitted to slaughter meat in their towns.
Right, but that's after they go into the land.
Development between Leviticus 17 and Deuteronomy 12.
But it's a logical one, and we'll see that one.
Right.
This one's not a logical one for the very reason of Leviticus 17. In Leviticus 17, it kind of summarized the crucial aspect of knowing how the animal died, because you must know about the disposition of the blood. An animal that dies of itself doesn't bleed to death, and therefore the animal was, and the heart stopped. So it's too late. The animal has not been killed in a proper manner. Okay, so the very gist, this is the complicated part, but this may be his iniquity. That in eating, and it may be clarified then by Deuteronomy, in that you don't do this. It also may be that his iniquity is his corpse uncleanness, that he has touched the corpse of a dead animal. I don't know. Again, I don't believe the Bible contradicts itself. I think that when I encounter these things, I do my best to try to figure out what one means versus the other one. And if I don't, I just chalk that up to I'm not seeing something. But bearing is iniquity. That's a new formula, isn't it? It's not used in the rest of Leviticus. He's cut off, and that we'll talk about in a moment, because that's a word that can mean a number of different things. But bearing is iniquity is the language of the purity laws. That if you don't submit yourself to the purity rituals, then the uncleanness that you have imbibed or that you have acquired now becomes iniquity. Because now it's rebellion. And so it's like, well, what is that iniquity or what is that guilt? And that word can be, it's somewhat flexible in Hebrew. And it may be the touching of a corpse, but if Deuteronomy is the fundamental rule, then the iniquity may be the fact that he ate of an animal whose blood was not properly disposed. Abe.
I was just thinking, it's almost like sin or uncleanness that can't be, because remember, you told us that how that this is unintentional sin.
Right.
But for this one, maybe there's no, I don't know.
Yeah, and the guilt offering, if guilt is the word, I don't know whether ESV, I didn't look into the actual Hebrew word, but if the guilt offering had to do with actual offenses where you defrauded your neighbor, okay, whereas the other ones, the sin offering, especially the trespass offering, they were for ignorant sins. And Numbers 5 tells us that for presumptuous sin there is no offering. Now, I don't think a man is maliciously rebelling against God when he takes a dead animal and takes it home and cuts it up and has it for a meal. I think he's still violating the principles that are behind all of this, and that is he's consuming the blood with the meat. The penalty in verse 16, though, in Leviticus 17, doesn't seem to fit what we read up here. Okay. So it's an anomaly. I don't feel like I have, if you read through the notes, you get to that section, you might think, well, Chuck didn't do much with this one. Hopefully I did better than most commentaries. I don't just reread the passage to you. I'm serious. You get into these chapters, you pull up the commentary, you think this is a renowned, and they're just rereading. It's like, where's my blanket and my wafer? They're going to sit us around and reread the chapter to us. But they use different words, and that is so helpful. I could just buy a paraphrase. It's frustrating. And so I hope I don't do that. If I do that, let me know. All right, so verses 15 and 16, I want to kind of get them out of the way. If you want to dig into them, I encourage you to do so. And if you come up with something, I encourage you to send me an email and let me know. But going back now to the inverted V, the other ones, we do have this formula, and yet we're kind of moving up to an apex in verses 10 through 12. But I want to talk about this phrase. We're kind of going to move around a little bit. We're going to look at this idea here of being cut off. What does it mean? Well, there are many, many places in the Old Testament where the phrase cut off is used with respect to a judicial act concerning somebody within Israel. They are cut off. And what I want to say is that there seems to be a gradation of punishments that involve being cut off. It's more of a rubric than it is an actual judicial sentence that is consistent all the way across the board. So cut off can mean, for example, forbidden from the cult, but not the community. Now, this is still, in our day and age, we talked about excommunication and how it really doesn't mean anything anymore, because if a church excommunicates somebody, they simply go to a different church the following Sunday. No questions asked and no judgments made. So that whole idea is meaningless. We have to put ourselves in the context of a people who themselves are not mighty and powerful, though they live in the midst of powerful empires, as well as many other peoples their size or a little larger that are all very militant. So all of the ites of that land, the Hittites, the Hittites were actually an empire, the Jebusites, the Hivites, all of them, they were not just peace-loving hippies dwelling, coexisting. They were constantly fighting. And we see this in the book of Judges, for example, that they didn't just fight the Israelites, they fought each other as well. And so here's this kind of this motley crew of former slaves that Yahweh has taken out from Egypt, and he's placed them. He hasn't placed them off in some safe, distant mountain where they can live and dwell in harmony and peace. No, they're right in the middle of a very, very active, they're right in the middle of the Levant. And all of the traffic between Egypt and the Mesopotamia would go straight through, because there's an ocean on one side and a desert on the other. So they're really very vulnerable. And much of what we read, when we read about God's promises, if you will obey my commands, then this will go for you, and this will go your way, and you will be a victor and not defeated. This was a very present danger in their lives. So to be cut off from the cult, I think, meant something. Now, I think as generations went on, it probably meant less and less as they generally apostatized. And you see that in the prophets, but we're not there yet. We talked about this fact, I think last week, as they went into the land, and they ended up much further from the temple, much more scattered, and there wasn't a wilderness right outside the camp anymore. I think they did become very complacent and lackadaisical concerning these things. And I think that's true within Christianity as well. During times of persecution, Christian devotion has historically been much more acute than it is in times of prosperity. So when this idea of being cut off from the cult, but not the community, that's still a punishment. But I do think the Scripture does seem to follow the principle that the punishment fit the crime. In other words, cut off doesn't mean the same thing in every single offense. The second one would be, however, exiled from the community. Cult meaning the tabernacle and later the temple, yeah. Yeah, I know the word has a, David Koresh kind of, Jim Jones kind of connotation, but that's not what the word means. So they're exiled from the community. And even these seem to have two degrees. One is outside the camp. And as I've said before, there seemed to be a sizable camp outside the camp. If you look at the impurity laws and how long they needed to be outside the camp before they could come back into the camp, you probably had a fair number of people with skin afflictions that were tagging along outside the camp. Yeah, right, a business opportunity. Oh, that's a good Jewish thought. So you have outside the camp, but then you have the idea of cast away, exiled, that the person is simply you're not coming back. And these there are examples of the phrase cut off, seeming to mean all of these different ones. And then finally, there's the one that seems most obvious, and that is executed. I mean, when God says if man's blood is shed by man, then by man that man's blood will be shed. That's execution. That's capital punishment. And they did have that. And it's also used, the phrase cut off, maybe cut off from the tabernacle, cut off from the camp, or cut off from the land of the living. So the phrase can have that flexibility. But there's an additional phrase that when added to it does seem to at least intensify it. And it's not really very often, but we read this: I will set my face against him. Well, this is the opposite of the Aaronic benediction, where Aaron says, "May God's countenance shine upon you." In other words, literally, may God's face be toward you. And this is, I'm setting my face against him. That sounds really serious. Okay. Now, the only other place that we can look at this is where the people would offer up their children to Molech and make their children pass through the fire of Molech. It was basically sacrificing their children. And the Lord responds by saying, I will set my face against that man and against his family if they don't deal with it. And so the context there again seems very much like that. If you read this, you're certainly not dealing with just that. And probably not even a exile from the community that is remediable, that there's a chance of getting back. It's no, they've committed, in a sense, they've committed an unpardonable sin. And God has set his face against them. And at that point, the only logical conclusion is death. Or if it is not death, then it is this permanent exile where there's no hope of restoration to Yahweh. Now, the psalm that Jesus cries out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's really what it's talking about. Why have you set your face against me? And what followed that? Jesus' death. So it does seem to be the most intense form of being cut off. And it is judicial, even in the sense of Jesus' death. We know that it's judicial, not in the sense that he had sins for which he was being judged, but that he became sin. And as Paul says in Romans 8, sin was condemned in the flesh on the cross. So God set his face against his own son in order to gain the victory and defeat sin. So this is all kind of wrapped up, this idea of being cut off and God setting his face. Here we read this phrase. We don't read it in any of these passages. We read it in this one. When we get to that's one of the things that makes that the peak, as well as what it says. Everything leads up to it and then kind of flows away from it in Leviticus 17. But in verses 10 through 12, and I think it's actually verse 10. Let me go back there and confirm that. Verse 10. And any man from the house of Israel, or from the aliens who sojourn among them, who eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood, and will cut him off. It also goes from the passive, he will be cut off, to the active, I will cut him off. So one of the reasons why this inverted V is significant is that the penalty intensifies and then decreases. And by the time you get to verse 16 or verse 15, the person's unclean until evening. That's not exactly God setting his face and personally cutting him off. So that means that as we read these things, here's really the hinge of it all. That's the keynote. That's not to say the other passages aren't as important, but they gain their importance, I think, essentially as examples of those key verses in the center. So let's take a look at them. I don't want to spend a great deal of time because I want to spend most of the time here at the heart of the matter, these three verses. But when we look at verses 3 through 7, there is, again, some controversy. Not the kind that is in 15 and 16. No apparent contradictions with any other verses, except the one in Deuteronomy 12, which is not really a contradiction. So he says, any man from the house of Israel who slaughters an ox or a lamb or a goat in the camp, or who slaughters it outside the camp, and has not brought it to the doorway of the tent of meeting to present it as an offering to the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, blood guiltiness is to be reckoned to that man. He has shed blood, and that man shall be cut off from among his people. Blood guiltiness, that's Genesis 9. That's that whole concept of shedding blood. And as the Lord said in Genesis 9, I will require at the hand. Now he's talking about the blood of an animal. So God is going to require the blood of an animal at the hands of this man, which seems a little bit, with our idea of the food chain, we kind of think that we're on top and that we're kind of immune from whatever we do. No, we're not. Okay, that's what Deuteronomy or Genesis 9 says. I will require the blood from an animal or from a man. But here it's saying, I'm going to require it of a man who kills an animal. Now, what do you notice about the animals mentioned? They are sacrificial animals. That's significant. Because there are a number of other animals that are clean, but are not sacrificial. Now, this provision is taken away in Deuteronomy 12.
Even if he kills it in a kosher way, he has to bring the whole animal to the...
Yep. And he's going to give a reason in verses 4 through 7. Okay, so he's going to explain why. But he's also going to remove this provision. Oops, I closed the... Let me see if I have it in the notes. Might be quicker. He's going to remove this provision in Deuteronomy 12, where he says that when you enter the land and you live too far away from where I will cause my name to dwell, he gives permission for them to then slaughter a sacrificial animal at their tent, in the camp, or in their village. What is that verse? I don't have it immediately. Deuteronomy 12:21. Okay, thank you. Yeah, okay, here it is. If the place which the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far from you, well, actually, in verse 20, it says that when the Lord your God extends your border, they're in the land now, and the place where God chooses to put his name is too far from you, then you may slaughter of your herd and flock, which the Lord has given you, as I have commanded, you and your sons may eat within your gates, whatever you desire. Your herd and your flock, that's your cattle and your goats and your lambs. In other words, that's your sacrificial animals. Now, we do know that not every animal in a herd or a flock was suitable for sacrifice, right? They had to be without blemish. Some of them had to be a year old. Some were males. Some could be females, okay? So there were further restrictions, and they're not mentioned in Leviticus 17. It just simply says your ox, your lamb, your sheep, or your goats. That's the category of sacrificial land animals. All right? And then in Deuteronomy 12 we read that you may slaughter them at your gate. You're too far to have to take it up to the tabernacle in Shiloh or the temple in Jerusalem, so you may. But he goes on to say in verse 23, only be sure not to eat the blood, for the blood is the life, and you shall not eat the life with the flesh. So there it is. That principle doesn't change. Now, Leviticus 17 refers to this as a perpetual ordinance, and yet it seems like it's removed in Deuteronomy 12. I think the solution to that is that the perpetual ordinance is not that every animal that you're going to slaughter for a meal has to be taken to the temple. I think the perpetual ordinance is twofold, verse what we read in 4 through 7, and also don't eat the blood. That's the perpetual ordinance. Don't eat the blood.
But also in part of verse 23.
In Deuteronomy 12?
Yeah. The unclean and the clean alike may eat of it. So it's almost like there's no distinction here.
You mean verse 22?
22, I'm sorry.
Just as a gazelle or a deer is eaten, so you shall eat it. The unclean and the clean alike may eat of it. That's not the unclean and the clean of the animals. That's the unclean and the clean of the people. So that if you are ritually unclean, you can still have dinner. I mean, you're outside the camp, you can still eat. Not the animals, no. It's the subject. The unclean and the clean may eat of it. Right? So it's the unclean and the clean are those who are doing the eating, not that which is being eaten. So Deuteronomy 12 is not changing that distinction between clean animals and unclean. It is a rather awkward way of putting it. When I first read it, I thought, whoa, I hadn't seen that before. But the syntax is pretty clear that he's talking about it. There's no, there were other things that, this is also something that we should consider. Most of the world today does not eat meat regularly. We do, but most of the world doesn't. And the ancient world rarely ate meat on a regular basis. It was usually a festival meal, not we take it for granted that we're going to get some protein with our salad. No, they had their salad. They didn't eat a lot of meat. So what we're talking about here is not something that just happened on a regular occurrence in every single house. But why the distinction in Leviticus 17 that is then removed in Leviticus 12? Well, I think Leviticus 17 gives us the reason, verses 4 through 7. Well, let me start at 5 through 7, excuse me. The reason is, so that helped. When it says the reason is, that's really nice. Normally we don't get it quite that clear. The reason is, see, there's a lesson to be taught here. It's almost a catechism. Israel in the wilderness was fresh out of Egypt. And in fact, with the death of the generation that came out of Egypt, the second generation is the first generation of the wilderness. And these are the ones that God said in Exodus 19, if you will obey my commands, you will be to me a holy people, a royal priesthood. Well, that doesn't just mean, and we're going to see this in the Holiness Code, that doesn't just mean do this and do that. It does also mean stop doing these other things. It was very, very common in the ancient world as well as in Paul's day. It was very, very common that whatever meat that was to be slaughtered for food was somehow to be associated with a deity. So the whole idea of meat sacrificed to idols is part of this milieu that we're reading back in the wilderness. Because that is a major feature of the pagan religion, is that your meat, it wasn't sacrificed in the sense of a peace offering or whatever. It was just your evening meal. but you took it to the temple to have it sanctified before you brought it home and prepared it for dinner. So this was the mindset of the ancient pagan world from which Israel has been extracted. And so he says the reason is so that the sons of Israel may bring their sacrifices, which they used to be sacrificing in the open places, in the open field, that they may bring them to the Lord at the doorway of the tent of meeting to the priest, and sacrifice them as sacrifices of peace offerings to the Lord. In other words, you got to change your whole mentality here. It's almost a sense of Moses saying, do not be conformed to the world, but rather be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Now, I didn't make that phrase up. I was quoting somebody there. You need to stop doing what you were doing, and what you were doing in Egypt, and apparently what they were still doing in the wilderness, because he keeps going on, he says in verse 6, and the priest shall sprinkle the blood on the altar of the Lord at the doorway of the tent of meeting, and offer up the fat in a smoke and soothing aroma to the Lord. And they shall no longer sacrifice their sacrifices to the goat demons with which they play the harlot. This shall be a permanent statute to them throughout the generations. So the permanent statute is not that they have to take every goat or lamb or bull or cow to the place where God causes his name to dwell, even if they're planning on using it for a family feast. That's not the perpetual sacrifice or statute. The perpetual statute is you don't offer up to God in your backyard. He has caused his name to dwell. This is the whole geography of holiness now. God has caused his presence to dwell in the tabernacle, and he has situated that presence through the priesthood that he has anointed. And they are the only ones who are allowed to manipulate the blood. You don't see any sacrifice where the offerer sprinkles the blood. They kill the animal, but then the blood is manipulated by the priest for the sacrifice.
You put me in mind, too, of another switch in how things work. And they brought the meat of their peace offerings to the tent. They were bringing them to where the Levites lived. In Deuteronomy 12, it says, when they slaughter their meat in their towns, they shall not forget the Levite.
Well, then they'll feed him.
Right.
They're to give him, they're to give him some of the food. That's a good point. The Levites are now scattered also throughout the land, and their livelihood is dependent upon the people of the tribes who had an inheritance, and the tribes were to remember the Levites. They were to give them some of the food, so that the actual dynamic was still happening, but it was really the perpetual statute is you got to get it out of your mind that you can just do what you want and where you want to. Because in fact, what you are doing, and they say in my name, but he says it's goat demons. It's not me. That's something that really blows people's mind when you tell them, I know you say you worship God, but that's not God. And they get, they're not real happy with that diagnosis, but it's been happening for millennia, where even those cultures that believed in one God, it wasn't the true God. And so what these people were doing, they were doing it in the name. It's kind of like when Aaron made the golden calf, what did he say? Behold your God who brought you out of Egypt, right?
And tomorrow there shall be a feast to Yahweh.
Yeah, a feast to Yahweh, okay, so it's like, there we go, there we see it. But did anybody catch the goat demon thing? Doesn't that kind of remind you of something that we just read? Azazel. Okay, and I don't know what connection there is, but I do want to point out that it was not made just by me, that it was made very, very much by Jewish writers. Let me see if I can. Where is that? I want to find that quote because 226. Bear with me a moment. I don't. The word actually means the furry one. So I don't know. No, that's not it. 224 perhaps. Now, if I don't find it, that's okay. Hopefully you'll be able to read it in the notes. No, I'm not 227. One more page. Oh, here it is. Yeah, I found it. Okay. This is from the Jewish Encyclopedia, okay? Talking about the goat demon. They were called the Sa'irim, which means hairy beings, to which the Israelites sacrificed in the open fields are satyr-like demons described as dancing in the wilderness in Isaiah 13, verse 21, and are identified with the jinn of the Arabian woods and deserts. To the same class belongs Azazel, the goat-like demon of the wilderness, probably the chief of the Sa'irim. Okay. So at least in Jewish tradition, we have a link here. We have kind of a link between chapter 16 and chapter 17, and maybe it sheds a little bit more light on the Azazel goat. That you don't, remember we said a number of times, that was not a sacrifice. That goat being taken out into the wilderness was not being sacrificed to Azazel. It was being taken out, but it wasn't killed. Its blood wasn't shed, and that blood was not offered in any way, shape, or form to Azazel. That's a very important principle in chapter 16, because you can get into a real deep pit of error if you think that God was ordering a sacrifice to a demon. But apparently they were already doing that. Now, it may be that they weren't fully aware of what they were doing, but I don't know about that. I find it hard to believe that Aaron, for example, was just that stupid. Okay? I mean, I really don't think that he thought that cow was Yahweh. But then, what I'm saying is no different than what Isaiah says about idolaters to begin with. Are they really that stupid? You cut up a piece of wood, right? And you use some of it to bake your bread, and use some of it to put in the fire and warm your hands, and then you carve the other into an idol and say, oh my God. And he's making fun of them. You're really not that stupid, are you? So they may have some idea from their own pagan history and their pagan environment in Egypt that what they were doing when they were offering up sacrifices in their own tents was not to Yahweh. So that teaches us, in a sense, this is kind of the Old Testament regulative principle. I've now shown you how to do it. You don't do it any other way. I've shown you where to do it. You don't do it any other place. Okay? So that's kind of the principle here about, and that's why I think in verses 3 and 4, it's limited to the sacrificial animals. Those are the animals that, as long as they were in the wilderness, it seems that if you wanted to have a feast, and let's say the prodigal son comes back and you want to slaughter the cow and have a feast, well, then you needed to take that to the tabernacle, have it slaughtered there. The blood, it's basically a peace offering, so that the meat belongs to the offerer, and the blood is sprinkled on the altar, and you may now take the meat home and prepare dinner. Now, when they went into the land, as we read in Deuteronomy 12, that restriction was lifted. But nonetheless, that's the first level then, is what do you do with the sacrificial animals when you just want to have one for dinner? Well, you got to take it to the tabernacle. Starting in verse 8 then, trying to move through these kind of quickly. And then you shall say to them, any man from the house of Israel, or from the aliens who sojourn among them, who offers a burnt offering or sacrifice, and does not bring it to the doorway of the tent of meeting, to offer it to the Lord, that man shall also be cut off from his people. This is an extension of the first one, and it may be stylistic in the sense that they're not even planning on eating this one. And they might think, oh, okay, I'm planning on eating it, and I understand I need to offer the blood to Yahweh so that I have his blessing then to eat the meat. But I'm not planning on eating. Remember, burnt offerings were not eaten by anybody but the Lord. None of the meat went to the priests, and none of the meat went to the offerer. It was all burned on the altar. So I think that's why we go from a peace offering up above, and now we go to a burnt offering and say, okay, you may reason in your mind, well, I'm not going to eat this. I'm just going to offer it up to the Lord, and I'm just going to do it right here outside my tent. And the Lord says, no, I'm now here. I've established now the method of your approach. And remember what the Lord said to Aaron at the death of his sons, by those who come near me, I shall be holy. Well, now he's saying that to the whole congregation. If you can do things, really, you can kind of apply this to the idea that somebody can worship God anywhere. Because God's omnipresent, right? He's everywhere. So I can worship him on the golf course, or I can worship him in my bedroom. I don't really need to go to church, except that God has ordained that we should be baptized into one body, and that the communion of the saints is the communion of the body of the Lord. So he's like, no, you say that's what you're doing. And what you're actually doing is no different than when the Israelites worshipped to the goat demons. Okay, so when you're worshiping God in nature and you're saying, I'm communing with Yahweh, I'm communing with Jehovah, Jehovah's saying, no, you're not, because you're not doing it the way I told you, and therefore I'm not there. It's a figment of your imagination, which is the same thing as saying an idol or a goat demon. So he's inculcating a new way of life, which reminds us that these people were not discipled Yahweh worshipers in Egypt. We should have got that simply for the trouble that Moses had getting them out of Egypt, and all the way through the wilderness. This was not, a Christian retreat, that they were already worshiping the true God. No, what did Moses say before he went back? Who shall I say sends me? Right? Because they're not going to know. Moses is probably thinking, I don't know. Who is you? Who do I say sent me? So these are not, and I think sometimes we get the impression that, again, Abram came out already with a halo on his head as he came out of Ur of the Chaldees. No, he was a rank pagan. God called him out of that. And the Israelites, after 400 years in Egypt, they were not worshiping in spirit and truth. And they had probably imbibed, if not all, of the Egyptian paganism, then brought it with them as they went out into the world. And God said, that's got to stop. So there are things, and we haven't talked much about this because you know how sensitive I am to turning our faith into moralism. But there is, and we're going to get into this as we get into Romans 12, there is absolutely some things that you just got to stop doing when you're born again. God has now caused his name to dwell in you. Therefore, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3 and 6, there are things you got to stop doing. And some of those things are pretty amazing. We think, okay, you got to stop with the fornication, you got to stop with the murder, you got to stop with the thievery and robbing, right, and defrauding. You got to also stop with the gossip, right? That's one of them that he mentions. There's so many things. He's like, you got to stop that. So what he's saying here to them in these first 9 verses is he's saying, okay, there are things that you were doing, and it's almost as if what Paul says in Acts 14, considering the other nations of the world, he says God winked at them. God really wasn't paying attention to them. And so the Israelites for 400 years in Egypt, and then for 40 years, or at least up until Sinai, not 40 years, God did not punish them for what they were doing. They acted in ignorance. But now that they have been given knowledge and the presence of God, that is no longer an excuse. And God is no longer going to give them any leeway, any slack. He says, no, I'm going to cut them off. You're going to cut that person off because they will bear their blood guiltness because they didn't bring the animal to the tabernacle and offer it. Essentially, you're offering your evening meal as a peace offering, and then God is giving it back to you for dinner. Okay? So it wasn't just what we read about in Leviticus 1 through 7. Now it's pretty much any time you're planning on having lamb or goat or steak, you took it to the tabernacle. Verses 13 and 14, very quickly. We're going to jump to the other side of the apex. This is a good one. When any man from the sons of Israel, from the aliens who sojourn among them, in hunting catches a beast or a bird which may be eaten, there's that, it's got to be clean to begin with, he shall pour out its blood and cover it with earth. For as for the life of all flesh, the blood is identified with its life. Therefore I said to the sons of Israel, shall not eat the blood of any flesh, for the life of the flesh is in the blood, and whoever eats it shall be cut off. Verse 14 is really a reiteration of verse 10. But I want to throw in something here. There are a number of animals that are clean but are not herd or flock animals. Gazelles, deer, for example. You hunt them. Okay, so there's no biblical prohibition, it seems, against hunting. But I will ask this, in light of what we're reading about the sanctity of the blood of these animals, essentially what you do here is you have to slaughter it. Now, you're out on the hunt. So you're not going to be bringing this thing back alive to the tabernacle. You don't have all these people with sheep and goats and cows coming in, and then somebody's got a deer, and someone's got a gazelle, No, you shot it, or bow and arrow, you killed it on the hunt. And then you immediately slit its throat because its blood must be poured out. And then it must be buried because it is essentially the life of that beast. This is this whole concept kind of flows in the undercurrent of C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia and the treatment of animals. It also throws you see it in a scene. We talk about how the ancient world viewed blood, but what about our modern novels about vampires or zombies, right? How do they continue their existence? Big Macs, blood, right? And then there's a scene in the Harry Potters when the reviving Voldemort is drinking the blood of a unicorn, because a magical evil person needs magical blood to live. So the idea of the life is in the blood is still with us even in the 21st century. It's not something that we can relegate to ancient pagans. We still have that kind of an understanding that blood is very important. And so I want to put this out there, not really to discuss it, and I hope it's not too offensive, but I wonder what this does say about hunting for sport. Hunting for food is hunting for food, but the idea of hunting for sport, what does all this say to us as just human beings? I don't even mean as Christians, but if the life is in the blood, and we've been given that for food, where does this come up with the idea that we are hunting for trophies? I personally just don't think that there's any call for it at all. I don't think it's appropriate at all.
But hunters always eat.
Well, not always. Not big game hunters. No, not always. No, I have no problem with hunting for. Yeah. I have no problem with people. Taking it, making venison and all. I don't get me wrong. I think that's perfectly legitimate, and I don't think there's anything. I do think though that what all this does teach us is it kind of reminds us of the intimate connection that man has with the created world. That we're not sitting on top of the heap just doing whatever we want. God is making it clear you can't do that. That I will call you to account when you act in such an imperious manner. So I'm not talking about people, and I don't think it probably applies to anybody here. I don't know how many of you are just big game hunters that go over and slaughter rhinoceros so you can put the trunks in your living room wall. I don't think any of you do that. I'm just saying, as conceptually, is that even a valid thing for someone who is bearing the image of God, the creator of all life, to just be hunting for sport? Right? I know hunting is a sport, and that most hunters, in fact all the ones I ever knew, will then eat. They will package, they'll give it away. I mean, it'll actually become food. So it's not really a big issue, but there are those out there that are basically trophy hunters, and I think that's Again, not even as a Jew or a Christian. I think if we understand what God has done here, I don't think that's a legitimate occupation at all.
And could that get taken too far with like maybe even killing a snake or catching a mouse in the house?
Oh, anything could be taken too far. Yeah, I'm not saying that we should become pacifists and not kill any animals or cockroaches or whatever. I'm not. I know there's a chance of being misunderstood. I'm talking about people who are basically going out to kill for trophies, to say I bagged a lion or I bagged an elephant, and I'm not even sure that they're good food. It's a mentality that I think is a modern representative of the opposite of what we're seeing here. Okay, I don't want to be misunderstood. I think you can take out a rat. You can step on a spider.
We know these things when we see them. They're accompanied by an inordinate amount of pride.
They are.
And like you said, imperiousness
Yeah.
over creation.
Right. And I think that will factor into the judgment. I think that what I'm trying to say here is from Noah on through to Moses, what we're seeing here is that man in the image of God is at all times integrally related with the rest of creation. That we're not simply, again, on top of it doing as we please. Okay? We are stewards. And this is the way we steward, this is the way the Israelites were to steward. They were to make sure the blood was properly drained and properly buried, and then the food was free to eat.
I'll get to this in my own lessons a little bit, but they were even not going to defeat enemies far ahead of their ability to settle the land, that the wild beasts not multiply against them. And there's definitely an aspect of that is that you have to stomp out dangerous wild beasts.
Right,
That was not part
right,
of God's intention for Israel.
And David, of course, killed a bear and killed a lion. So there was grace both for the animals as well as the people, not to let them conquer more land than they could settle, because they were bringing civilization to the land, which meant the wild animals would eventually be killed off. And again, I don't think that you necessarily, if you were killing a lion because it was threatening your flock, you didn't have to then take the lion quickly and sacrifice it and eat it. That's, again, we're talking about a mentality that is still in the world with us today, that is imperious and that completely violates the spirit of what we're reading in terms of concern for those animals. The righteous man, the psalm says, the righteous man has concern for his beast. Okay.
It's almost like when he buries the blood and drains the blood, it's almost like he's being a priest.
In a sense, he is, and that's a good point. I appreciate you making that, because it very much is. Because remember, those grades of holiness, the people were also holy. Now, when they're on the hunt, they didn't take their resident priest with them. So yes, in a sense, they were disposing of the blood properly, which is a priestly function. Okay, and that is exactly what Exodus 19, verse 6 says. You will be to me a nation of priests. Okay, so that is a very good comment. Now let's get to the heart of the matter as we finish up here, and that is verses 10 through 12 and the idea of the blood. Now this is going to come out even more next week as we look at a very enigmatic statement that Jesus makes in John 6 concerning his own flesh and his own blood. And next week we're going to exegete John 6, but I want to do it, and this was a very difficult lesson to prepare because I didn't find anybody else who's looking at it this way. Okay, we'll get into that next week in terms of how commentators have looked at what Jesus says, that unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you will have no life in you. Okay, that statement was offensive to the Jews. It was confusing to the disciples. Okay, and it has been confusing to commentators ever since. So, but when we look at the blood, then this is kind of leading into what we'll talk about next week. But what I want to point out in the passage, verses 10 through 12, let me read those. And I would ask that you read them during the week and kind of mull them over, ruminate on them. Whoops, that's chapter 18. Okay. And any man from the house of Israel or from the aliens who sojourn among them, who eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood and will cut him off from among his people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood by reason of the life that makes atonement. Therefore I said to the sons of Israel, no person among you may eat blood, nor may any alien who sojourns among you eat blood. That is one of the most important verses in the Torah. And if it uses the word kippur, it uses the word atonement. And so what we see in this verse is an excellent summary lesson. Now we've seen that atonement doesn't necessarily mean forgiveness of sin. Remember, the house that had a leprous spot was atoned. The clothing was atoned, okay? So there was atonement that cleansed, atonement that purified, atonement that forgave. So the word atonement actually is a more flexible word. But here it kind of all comes together. And God says, the key to atonement is the blood. And the key to the blood is the life. And I, who am the sovereign of all life, have given it to you on the altar. So whatever is being atoned, whether it's sins being forgiven, uncleanness being purified, or even inanimate objects being purified, okay, so you understand what I'm saying? That the actual action of atonement had a number of different avenues, but it was still the same word, atonement. What was key was the blood on the altar. Okay. All right, so two reasons then are given here, and I don't know that it's really obvious. And this is where what I said about the similarities between ancient Israelite ritual and the pagans around it, this is where we realize that what's being done here is completely corrective. That, yeah, the pagans had an understanding that the blood and the life were related very intimately, but they had completely corrupted that understanding to the point where they were actually taking to themselves the life that was in the blood. And that really is an offense to the God who gives life to animals as well as to man. So for man to take blood is to usurp the place of God. Notice that the passage says, eat blood. That is odd. Blood is a liquid. Okay. Now, what that means, before I get to the two reasons, let me put that up there really quickly. The idea of eat blood. Okay. Does that mean you can drink it? Some things aren't forbidden explicitly because they're so blatantly obvious that you shouldn't do it, that it is not necessary to forbid it. The description of the blood as the life forbids the drinking of it. That's not the point here. The point is you must not eat the meat with its blood. That's what the eating of the blood means. Because he's already shown, both in all of the rituals that we've looked at, but now explicitly in these other sections of Leviticus 17, that you must pour out the blood. Okay, that does not mean that you have drained the animal completely dry of blood. That's not the point. The point is you must empty the body of its life before you may have its meat. And what you do with that life is important. If it's within the camp, you must take it to the priest, and he will apply it to the altar. If it's out on the hunt, you must drain it out on the ground and bury it. Does that make sense? You have to have respect for the life. To eat an animal with its blood still in it, meaning you've killed it but you haven't drained its blood, is to disrespect life itself. Okay? So this idea of eat blood, this is the same as to do with meat with its blood. The rabbis came up with a lot of goofy stuff over the millennia. None of them ever came up with the idea that it's okay to drink blood because the Bible only forbids it from eating blood. Okay? It is very clear that blood itself was a forbidden, an unclean substance for them to consume. But what we're talking about here is the animals the meat that they eat. The life must be drained out of it and properly dealt with before the meat is then eligible for food. Okay. Now, the two reasons that God gives for not eating the blood. The first one, so it's two reasons. That reason is a Genesis reason. That goes back to Genesis 9. That's a creation reason, although meat was not available for food between Adam and Noah, okay, or Adam and the flood. But had it been, this would have still prevailed. This is simply the principle that all life is created by God and sustained by God. So the life is in the blood, and that doesn't belong to man. Okay? The second reason is a covenant reason. So this is a creation reason. Life belongs only to God. Okay? It is not ours. Now, life can be judicially forfeit. So that doesn't mean that this is not opposing capital punishment, but it is judicially done so, for example, on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses, right? God even controls that. And when blood I think of a beast as well as a man, but certainly we see it biblically as a man, when it is unrighteously shed, what does that blood do? Cries out to God from the earth, right? The life has been wrongfully taken, and it cries out. So it's even personified in the case of Abel, and also of others that we read in the prophets, that the blood cries out to the Lord from the earth. So I don't know, that just gives me a different perspective on all life. Not that we can't kill a rat, but that we should have a better and deeper respect for life itself. I'm not sure that it's possible for someone who truly understands what we're reading to ever enjoy killing. I just don't see how. I mean, it's like it's a product of a corrupted world that we corrupted through sin, and I don't see how it can ever be. Again, I don't see how it could ever be sport, personally. But the other reason, though, is a covenant reason. And that is God has given it. This is somewhat like the incense on the altar. God has given the recipe. You may not use it for common use. And this is now applies to blood. That God has given the blood, and that's very important. God has given it. The Israelites didn't come up with this ritual. God gave it to them. And just shedding blood, which they had been doing to the goat demons apparently for generations, playing the harlot, he says, wasn't doing anything because God hadn't given it. If God doesn't give it, it has no sanctifying power. We talked about this. Abe, you made the comment last week that the blood has no inherent power. What it has inherently is life. But that life is not inherently atoning. That life is itself corrupt. It is susceptible to death. Whether it's an animal life or a human life, it has all been corrupted by sin. Not personal sin on the animal's part, unless it's a cat. So this is the covenant. Okay, you have a creation, once again, you have a creation reason and you have a covenant reason. You have a reason that takes you back to Noah, but you now have a reason that takes you more back to Abraham. Both of them also take us forward to John 6. Let's close in prayer. Father, we do pray that you would guide us through these complex chapters and help us to dig into them and to understand them, but really to see more of your nature, your purpose, what you have structured not only into salvation, but into creation itself, and that we might come away better understanding your mind, your purposes, and your world. But we do ask, even more than that you would help us to see Jesus in these things, to understand how his life and death and resurrection are the fulfillment of even Leviticus 17. And we ask that you would do this, that we might grow in our faith and our understanding of the great work of salvation that you have brought to us through Jesus Christ. For it is in his name we pray. Amen.